All right, so today we're diving into some really interesting stuff by Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh, yeah. He's definitely a thinker who keeps you on your toes.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And, it's funny because we had a request from a listener who specifically wanted to unpack Rousseau's ideas on society and human nature.
Yeah, that whole question of, are we good or is it society that corrupts us? It's like a question we never stop asking ourselves, right?
Totally. And to get to the bottom of it, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Rousseau.
That's a great starting point. Got all the essentials.
Exactly. But here's the thing about Rousseau. I think to really wrap your head around his philosophy, you almost have to understand the man himself.
Yeah, his biography reads like a soap opera sometimes, doesn't it?
It really does. It's full of drama, passion, and let's just say a few scandals along the way.
Enough to make you wonder if it influenced his views on society just a little bit.
Right. So let's rewind the clock back to 1712, Geneva, Switzerland. That's where our story begins with the birth of Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
And from what I understand, his entry into the world was marked by tragedy.
Yeah, very much so. His mother died just days after he was born, leaving him to be raised by his father.
Who was a watchmaker, if I remember correctly.
That's right, and not just any watchmaker. He was a citizen of Geneva, which was a big deal back then. It came with certain rights and privileges that not everyone enjoyed.
Interesting. So even from a young age, Rousseau would have been exposed to this idea of social status and belonging.
Exactly. And as he grew older, those themes of individuality and societal expectations would become central to his work.
Yeah.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Right back to the young Rousseau.
So picture this Rousseau as a teenager, already showing signs of that independent streak that he'd become known for.
I'm sensing a rebellious phase coming on.
Oh yeah, big time. At 16, he runs away from home, leaving Geneva behind to forge his own path.
And he doesn't just run away, he converts to Catholicism, which, in those days was a pretty bold move.
Huge. It was a statement of independence on multiple levels, rejecting the religious norms of his upbringing and embracing something new, something different.
And then later in life, he switches back to Calvinism. It's like he was constantly questioning, exploring, never content to settle for the status quo.
And that's what makes him so fascinating. He never shied away from challenging conventions, whether in religion or later on in philosophy and politics.
Yeah.
It was like he had this innate drive to dissect everything, to get to the core of what makes us tick both as individuals and as a society.
I can see why he got into some hot water with his ideas.
Oh yeah, big time. His writings were considered quite controversial, even scandalous in some circles.
Like what kind of scandals are we talking about? Don't leave me hanging.
Well, there were love affairs, of course. And not just a few. He also fathered 5 children, but ended up abandoning them, which definitely raised some eyebrows back then.
Wow, okay. That's quite a departure from the image of the solitary philosopher pondering life's big questions.
Right. It goes to show that behind those profound ideas was a real, complex human being, full of contradictions and flaws, just like the rest of us.
But even with all the drama and controversy, he still managed to achieve some success in his lifetime, didn't he?
Absolutely. He actually gained some recognition for an opera he wrote. And believe it or not, he also got caught up in heated debates about music theory.
Music theory? That doesn't sound very scandalous.
Well, the scandal wasn't so much in the theory itself, but in Rousseau's audacity to question things that others considered settled.
So he was kind of like the philosophical rebel of his day.
Exactly. And speaking of rebellion, his most famous philosophical works, the very ideas he's known for today, actually got him into some serious trouble.
You mean condemned in both Paris and Geneva kind of trouble?
That's right. His critiques of societal structures and his radical ideas about individual freedom didn't sit well with the authorities.
Yeah, that tends to happen when you challenge the status quo, especially in those days.
No kidding. But here's the irony of it all. Despite being condemned during his lifetime years after his death, the French revolutionaries were so inspired by his ideas that they moved his remains to the Pantheon in Paris, a place reserved for France's greatest heroes.
It's like he went from being a condemned radical to a celebrated icon.
Talk about a plot twist. But it just goes to show the enduring power of Rousseau's ideas. They resonated deeply even with those who were initially opposed to him.
So maybe there's something to be said for challenging conventions, for poking at those uncomfortable truths that society tries to sweep under the rug.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Rousseau did. He forced people to confront the contradictions within themselves and within the societies they created. He made them question everything they thought they knew about human nature and the very foundations of their world. So that brings us to that big question our listener had. The one about whether we're born good or if it's society that corrupts us. What did Rousseau think?
Well, it's funny because in a way, Rousseau turns the whole thing on its head. Well, think about it. For centuries, the dominant narrative, especially in the West, has been this idea of original sin, right? Like we're born flawed, inherently bad.
Right, the whole Adam and Eve biting the apple thing.
Exactly. It's like we're born with this stain on our souls. But Rousseau comes along and says, hold on a minute, maybe it's not us. It's not that we're inherently bad, it's the systems we create, the societies we build that lead us astray.
Okay, so he's flipping the script.
Yeah.
Instead of blaming our flawed human nature, he's pointing the finger at society itself.
Exactly. And that's what makes his ideas so radical, so thought-provoking. He's basically saying that deep down we have this capacity for goodness, this inherent purity, but it's like society throws a wrench in the works.
How does this corruption actually happen? Where does it all begin for Rousseau?
Well, he starts with this idea of amour de soi, which you could translate as love of self, but it's not ego or vanity. It's more primal than that. It's that instinct for self-preservation, the drive to survive.
Okay, so it's like that basic need for food, shelter, safety, the things that keep us alive.
Exactly. And Rousseau says that this amour de soi is something we're all born with. It's kind of like our default setting. Yeah. It's what ensures that we as a species continue to exist.
Right. Makes sense. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's what keeps us going.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because Rousseau says we're also born with PDA, which is often translated as compassion or empathy.
So we have this drive to survive, but also this capacity to care for others, to feel their pain as our own.
Exactly. And for Rousseau, this PTA is just as natural, just as inherent as our instinct for self-preservation.
It's like we're hardwired for both, to take care of ourselves and to care for others.
And that's what makes us human for Rousseau, this tension between our individual needs and our social instincts.
So where does amour propre fit into all of this?
Yes. Oh, propre. This is where things get really interesting, because this is where society starts to exert its influence. Amour propre is a bit trickier to translate, but you could think of it as a kind of pride or vanity, a desire for recognition and approval from others.
So it's like wanting to be seen, wanting to be validated by those around us.
Exactly. And in a way, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we all want to be loved and respected.
Of course.
Yeah.
Not to mention that a healthy sense of self-worth can be a powerful motivator.
Absolutely. But here's the catch. According to Rousseau, society has a way of taking this natural desire for recognition, this amour propre, and twisting it into something unhealthy.
So how does that happen?
Well, think about it. In a society that values status and competition, we start to see ourselves through the eyes of others. We become obsessed with how we measure up with what others think of us.
It's like we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, trying to outdo each other for a bigger slice of the pie.
And that's where amour propre can become toxic. It's no longer about genuine self-love or healthy self-esteem. It's about feeding this insatiable need for external validation.
And that's what leads to corruption. For Rousseau, it's this distortion of our natural instincts that ultimately corrupts us.
Precisely. It's not that we're inherently bad, it's that society creates the conditions for our less noble impulses to flourish.
It makes you wonder what Rousseau would say about today's world with social media and the constant pressure to present this perfect image of ourselves.
Right. I mean, talk about a breeding ground for unhealthy amour propre. It's like we're all caught up in this never-ending cycle of comparison and competition, trying to outdo each other for likes and followers.
It's almost as if we've created a system that actively encourages this kind of distorted amour propre.
And that's the real tragedy of it all, because according to Rousseau, this constant need for validation, this obsession with what others think of us, it prevents us from connecting with our true selves, with that inherent goodness that he believes we're all born with.
Okay, so we've got these core elements of human nature, the amour de soi, the PT, and this tricky amour propre. But how does Rousseau see all of this playing out in the grand scheme of things? How do we go from wandering around in the woods to building these complex societies that seem to bring out both the best and worst in us?
Well, that's where his discourse on inequality comes in. It's like Rousseau's attempt to trace the trajectory of human development from those early stages to the societies we see today.
It was like a history book, but more philosophical.
Exactly. It's not so much about dates and names, but more about understanding the forces that shaped us as a species. How did we get from a state of nature to a state of inequality?
Okay, so let's rewind the tape. What does this state of nature actually look like for Rousseau?
Well, picture this pre-civilization. Humans are living in small, isolated groups, driven mostly by their basic needs. That amour de soi we talked about. That's what's front and center.
So it's all about survival at this point.
Pretty much, they're gathering food, seeking shelter, protecting themselves from the elements. And because they're mostly isolated, they don't really have much need for complex language or social structures.
Sounds kind of peaceful in a way.
It's definitely a simpler existence. Rousseau doesn't necessarily romanticize it, but he sees it as a kind of baseline for understanding human nature before society gets its hooks in us.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So if that's our starting point, what sets us off on the path towards civilization? What changes?
Well, according to Rousseau, things start to shift as human populations grow. We start to form families, small communities, and with that comes the need for more cooperation, more communication.
Makes sense. We're social creatures, after all.
Yeah.
It's kind of in our DNA to connect with others.
Right. But here's where that amour propre kicks in. Remember that desire for recognition, for validation.
Oh yeah, that double-edged sword.
Exactly. As we start living in closer proximity to each other, we become more aware of ourselves in relation to others. And that's when things start to get a little more complicated.
Because now it's not just about survival, it's about how we measure up against those around us.
Exactly. And this is where Rousseau sees a turning point in human history. The development of agriculture.
Agriculture, how does that change everything?
Well, think about it. With agriculture comes the idea of private property owning land, accumulating resources, and with that ownership comes inequality.
Ah, I see where you're going. Suddenly, it's not just about sharing resources and cooperating. It's about who has more, who has the best.
And that's where amour propre really starts to rear its ugly head. It's no longer just about wanting to be liked and respected. It's about wanting to be better than to have more than.
So that competitive spirit, that drive to get ahead,
Yeah.
it's not something we're born with. It's a product of the society we create.
That's what Rousseau believed. He saw it as a direct consequence of inequality, which he saw as the root of so many social ills.
And once you introduce inequality into the mix, it's like a domino effect, right? It creates this ripple of competition and conflict that can be really hard to escape.
Exactly. And this is where Rousseau's ideas become particularly relevant to our modern world, because think about it, have we really escaped this cycle of competition and inequality? Or has it just taken on new, more sophisticated forms?
That's a really good question. I mean, we might not be fighting over farmland anymore, but we're still competing for resources, for status, for power. Just look at the way we consume information these days. The constant barrage of advertising, the pressure to keep up with the Joneses.
It's like we're hardwired to compare ourselves to others, to strive for more, even when we have more than enough.
It's kind of depressing when you think about it. So, if Rousseau thought that inequality was the root of so many problems, did he offer any solutions? Was there a way out of this mess?
Well, he certainly tried. In his most famous work, The Social Contract, he lays out a vision for a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so what's the gist? How do we fix it?
Well, it's complicated. Rousseau doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does offer some guiding principles. One of the key ideas is this concept of the general will.
The general will, what's that all about?
So imagine if instead of being driven by our individual desires, we could somehow align our wills towards a common good, something that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
It sounds good in theory, but how on earth do you get everyone on the same page? We're all so different with our own unique needs and desires.
Rousseau knew it wouldn't be easy. In fact, he believed that achieving this kind of social harmony required a radical shift in how we think about ourselves and our relationship to society.
So it's not just about tweaking the system, it's about a fundamental change in our values, our priorities.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not just isolated individuals competing for scarce resources, but interconnected beings who are all part of something larger than ourselves.
That's a powerful idea. And it makes me think about Rousseau's views on education. Because if we want to create a more just and equitable society, it makes sense that we need to start with how we raise the next generation right.
Absolutely. And that's where his ideas on education, which he lays out in his novel Emile, are so relevant. He believed that traditional forms of education often stifled a child's natural curiosity and creativity.
So what did he propose instead?
He advocated for what he called negative education, which is basically the idea that children learn best through experience, through exploration, through making their own mistakes.
So instead of force-feeding them information, it's about creating an environment where they can discover things for themselves.
Exactly. It's about fostering their natural love of learning rather than forcing them to memorize facts and figures.
And I'm guessing compassion and empathy also play a big role in his philosophy of education.
Absolutely. Rousseau believed that nurturing those qualities was essential for creating well-rounded individuals who were capable of not just self-preservation, but also genuine care for others.
It's like he saw those qualities as the antidote to that toxic amour propre we talked about earlier.
Right. Because if we can teach children to value empathy and compassion over competition and self-interest, maybe, just maybe, we can break free from that cycle of inequality and create a more harmonious world.
It's a beautiful vision and one that feels incredibly relevant today. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I'm curious, what are your final thoughts? What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
You know, it's funny because Rousseau can be a bit of a downer sometimes, especially when he's dissecting all the ways in which society can corrupt us. But at the heart of it, I think there's a real sense of hope in his work.
Hope. How so?
Because even though he recognizes the dark side of human nature, he never loses sight of our potential for goodness, for compassion, for creating a world that's truly just and equitable.
It's like he's saying, yeah, things are messy and complicated, but we don't have to give up. We can still strive for something better.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, to never stop questioning, to never start pushing for a world that reflects our highest ideals, even if it feels like an uphill battle sometimes.
It's a message that resonates deeply, even centuries after Rousseau first put pen to paper. So to our listener who wanted to understand this complex thinker, I hope we've done him justice.
Me too. And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity even a little bit, I encourage you to dive into Rousseau's work for yourself. You might be surprised by what you find.
Absolutely. There's a reason his ideas have endured for so long. And who knows, maybe by grappling with those ideas ourselves, we can start to create a world that's a little bit more, just a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more in line with that vision of human potential that Rousseau so boldly articulated.